There are television moments that make you wince, moments that make the whole room go quiet. And then there are moments so jaw-dropping that they follow a show for the rest of its life. Fawlty Towers had one of those. A single scene, broadcast to millions of British living rooms, that set off a firestorm so intense it would eventually pull one of the greatest sitcoms ever made right off the air. And the strangest part? The man behind it all thought he was making a point. He thought the joke was obvious. He thought everyone would get it. But not everyone did. And the fallout would change British television forever. So before we get to that infamous moment, you need to understand how something this bold, this brilliant, and this dangerous even came to exist in the first place. Because the story behind Fawlty Towers is almost as unbelievable as anything that happened inside it. It starts not in a writer's room, and not on a studio backlot, but inside a real hotel, in a sleepy seaside town, where a group of comedians checked in expecting rest and instead got one of the most bizarre hospitality experiences of their lives. The year was 1970. The Monty Python team had traveled to Torquay, a quiet resort town on the English coast, to film Flying Circus. After a long day of shooting, they needed somewhere simple to sleep. What they found at the Glen Eagles Hotel was anything but simple. The man running the place was named Donald Sinclair, and from the moment guests walked through his door, it was clear that Sinclair had a very unusual idea of what customer service meant. He treated his guests not like people paying for a room, but like suspects who had wandered into a crime scene. He was suspicious, theatrical, and completely erratic in the most fascinating way imaginable. He didn't just bend the rules of hospitality. He shredded them, set them on fire, and then acted confused about why anyone was upset. One evening, Eric Idle left his briefcase in the hotel lobby for just a few minutes. Any reasonable hotel manager would have simply asked who it belonged to. Sinclair didn't do that. Without a single word of warning, he picked up the briefcase and hurled it over the garden wall. He had decided, entirely on his own, that it was probably a bomb. Not exactly the warm welcome anyone had in mind. And that wasn't even the strangest moment. When Terry Gilliam picked up his knife and fork in a way that Sinclair found personally offensive, the manager marched over and corrected his table manners in front of the entire dining room, as though poor utensil technique was some kind of serious moral failure. Complaints from other guests were handled the same way. Instead of listening or apologizing, Sinclair responded with barely concealed contempt. He made guests feel like the problem was them, not him. The atmosphere inside that hotel was so suffocating, so relentlessly absurd, that most people simply checked out early and never looked back. John Cleese watched all of this with wide eyes and a comedian's instinct. He didn't storm out. He didn't demand a refund. He pulled out a notebook. Because what Cleese recognized, almost immediately, was that Sinclair wasn't just rude. He was a character. Impossibly, perfectly, hilariously wrong for the job he was doing. And there was something almost poetic about watching a man so convinced of his own superiority fall apart in real time. Cleese took careful notes. He observed every outburst, every bizarre overreaction, every moment where Sinclair's fragile ego crashed into the wall of basic reality. Years later, sitting across from his then-wife and creative partner Connor Booth, he would open those notes and turn that bewildering hotel experience into something the world had never seen before. It would take 5 years for those notes to become a television show. But when they finally did, the result was unlike anything British audiences had ever watched. Fawlty Towers premiered on the BBC in September of 1975. And right from the very first episode, it was unlike anything else on television. At the center of it all was Basil Fawlty, played by Cleese himself, a tall, tightly wound hotel owner operating somewhere between barely functional and completely unhinged. Basil wasn't cruel for the sake of being cruel. He was desperate. He wanted so badly to run a respectable establishment, to be admired by upper-class guests, to feel like he had risen above his station. But the harder he pushed toward the dream, the faster everything fell apart around him. His wife Sybil, played with razor precision by Prunella Scales, saw right through him. She could deflate his ego with a single syllable and usually did. Polly, the young maid played by Connie Booth herself, was often the only person in the building operating at anything close to normal. And then there was Manuel, the lovable, hopelessly confused Spanish waiter portrayed by Andrew Sachs, who turned every small misunderstanding into a full-scale disaster with nothing more than a wide smile and a complete inability to understand what was being asked of him. The early critics didn't know what to make of it. Some called it chaotic. One reviewer described the first episode as a disaster, unsure whether the frantic pacing was intentional or simply a sign that no one had control of the production. But audiences understood immediately. They saw something in Basil that felt both hilarious and painfully familiar. He was every person who had ever been convinced they deserved better than what they had. Every person who believed that the world was conspiring against them personally. Every person who made a simple situation infinitely worse by refusing to just let it go. The show was a powder keg every week, and viewers couldn't stop watching to see what would finally set it off. There was genuine tension in every episode, even when the situation was completely ridiculous, because you always knew that Basil was about to do something that would make everything dramatically worse. The BBC had serious doubts after just the first 6 episodes. Ratings were decent, but the show was expensive to produce, and the critical reaction had been lukewarm at best. Executives debated whether to pull the plug entirely. But then the reruns began, and something remarkable happened. Word spread. Families gathered around their televisions, specifically to catch the episodes they had missed. Audiences who had dismissed it the first time around came back and found themselves laughing harder than they had in years. The numbers climbed. The conversations grew louder. And by the time the second series aired in 1979, 4 years after the first, Fawlty Towers had transformed from a risky curiosity into something the entire country was watching and quoting and talking about at work the next morning. But behind the scenes, things were more complicated than the laughter suggested. By the time filming began on that second series, John Cleese and Connie Booth were no longer married. The relationship had quietly ended, not with tabloid drama, but with the kind of private heartbreak that 2 professionals simply had to carry on through. They showed up every day, sat down at the writing table together, and built some of the finest episodes the show had ever produced. You would never have guessed, watching Basil and Polly bicker across the hotel lobby, that the 2 people who created those characters had just gone through something so personally painful. The cast followed their lead without hesitation. Andrew Sachs, who regularly endured genuine physical punishment for his role, including an actual bruise from a metal frying pan during an early take and real burns from a kitchen scene that went slightly too far, never once complained. He came back every time with the same warm, slightly bewildered expression that made Manuel one of the most beloved characters in British television history. Prunella Scales brought so much fierce intelligence to Sybil that even Cleese admitted, in real life, that the sound of her voice calling Basil's name was enough to unsettle him. These were people who gave everything they had to something they believed in. And it showed in every single frame. 12 episodes. That is all Fawlty Towers ever produced. 12 episodes across 2 series, spread over 4 years. And yet those 12 episodes did something that most shows running for a decade never manage. They became permanent. By the year 2000, the British Film Institute had ranked Fawlty Towers the greatest British television series of all time. Scholars studied its structure. Comedy writers used it as a textbook. Every episode was re-watched so many times that viewers could recite entire scenes from memory. It had become more than a sitcom. It had become a shared cultural experience that an entire generation carried with them. And then came the moment that changed everything. The episode was called The Germans. It aired in October of 1975 as part of that first series, and from the very first scene, it was already pushing into territory most British comedies wouldn't dare touch. The setup was almost deceptively simple. A group of German tourists had booked rooms at Fawlty Towers. Basil, who had recently suffered a concussion from a mounted moose head falling directly onto him, was already operating at well below his usual level of barely held-together competence. As the guests arrived, he gathered his staff and issued what he clearly believed was a perfectly reasonable instruction. Don't mention the war. It seemed logical to him. Avoid the topic. Keep things pleasant. Smile and move on. What happened next was one of the most spectacular collapses of self-control ever put on British television. Within minutes of meeting his German guests, Basil had done every single thing he had explicitly told himself not to do. The war references began slipping out almost immediately, small at first, almost accidental, but building in frequency and intensity with every passing second. His attempt to suppress the subject only made it more present, like a man trying very hard not to think about something and therefore thinking about nothing else. His speech became rambling and strange. His eyes took on that particular wildness that viewers had come to recognize as the moment Basil Fawlty had truly lost the thread. And then, in the moment that would be replayed and debated for decades, Basil launched into a full, wide-eyed imitation of Adolf Hitler, goose-stepping across the hotel lobby with his finger pressed beneath his nose as a fake mustache, arms rigid at his sides. The whole performance completely unhinged and delivered with a kind of manic conviction that only a man who has entirely lost the plot could possibly muster in front of paying hotel guests. The studio audience erupted. Many viewers at home laughed until they couldn't breathe. But not everyone was laughing. Letters began arriving at the BBC almost immediately. Some called it tasteless. Some called it deeply offensive. Some demanded the episode be pulled entirely and never broadcast again. BBC executives held tense internal meetings trying to figure out what to do with an episode that had gone further than anyone had anticipated when they approved it. The episode had not just pushed a boundary. It had sprinted past it without looking back. And while the corporation ultimately decided to let it stand, the debate inside those offices was long, heated, and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. For a time, the future of the entire show felt genuinely uncertain. What made the controversy so complicated was that Cleese had a clear artistic argument on his side. The target of the joke was never the German tourists. Anyone watching carefully could see that the German guests in the episode were calm, dignified, and increasingly bewildered by what they were witnessing. They were not the punchline. Basil was the punchline. Every war reference, every Nazi impression, every spiraling moment of social catastrophe was aimed directly at Basil himself, at his ignorance, his inability to control his own mouth, his panicked desperation to appear sophisticated while being constitutionally incapable of it. Cleese had said publicly, more than once, that the episode was about the British obsession with the Second World War, the way it lingered in the national consciousness decades after it had ended, shaping attitudes and conversations in ways people often didn't even fully notice. Basil wasn't celebrating anything ugly. He was being completely destroyed by it. But context, as it turns out, does not travel well across generations. When streaming platforms began making Fawlty Towers available to global audiences in the 2020s, the episode found itself in front of viewers who had no frame of reference for the specific cultural moment it came from. Several platforms quietly removed the Germans from their libraries without any announcement. Others edited specific scenes, trimming the most controversial moments and hoping nobody would notice. When fans discovered what had happened, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Supporters of the show argued that stripping out the content was not sensitivity, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of what the show was doing. That the entire point of the scene was being removed along with the scene itself, leaving behind a version that was both sanitized and meaningless. John Cleese, who has never in his life stayed quiet about something he disagrees with, said exactly what he thought. He called the edits a form of censorship carried out by people who had missed the joke entirely. He pushed back with the same uncompromising energy that had defined his entire career from the very beginning. The debate that followed was bigger than Fawlty Towers. It became a genuine flashpoint for a much wider argument about how old creative work should be treated in a rapidly changing world. Who gets to decide when satire has aged out of acceptability? Does removing a controversial scene protect people from harm, or does it actually erase the very critique the scene was making in the first place? These are not simple questions, and they do not have clean answers. But what they do prove is something important and undeniable. Fawlty Towers, a show that ended in 1979 and ran for only 12 episodes, still has the power to start serious arguments in the 21st century. That is not the mark of something irrelevant. That is the mark of something that cut all the way down to the bone and stayed there. The cast that gave the show its life did not escape the passage of time lightly. Andrew Sachs, whose Manuel had made the world fall in love with comedic physical suffering, continued working steadily for years before being diagnosed with vascular dementia. He passed away in 2016, leaving behind a legacy of warmth and dedication that everyone who worked with him spoke about with tremendous affection. Prunella Scales, who had been so magnificent as Sybil, was later diagnosed with the same cruel disease. Her husband, actor Timothy West, spoke with quiet grace about her condition, describing how even as her memory slowly faded, her warmth and her spirit never did. Ballard Berkeley, who played the bumbling Major Gowan with such endearing and completely outdated charm, passed away in 1988. Brian Hall, who brought anarchic energy to the kitchen as Terry the chef, died in 1997. Connie Booth walked away from the entertainment industry entirely after Fawlty Towers and quietly built a new life as a psychotherapist, leaving the chaos of the show behind with what seems, from the outside, like a very deliberate and hard-won sense of peace. John Cleese never stopped. Even now, well into his 80s, he continues working, continues arguing, and continues challenging the boundaries of what comedy is allowed to say and do in any era. In 2023, he announced that Fawlty Towers would return in a new series, this time co-written with his daughter Camilla Cleese. The announcement divided opinion sharply and immediately. Some saw it as an exciting chance to see a classic character navigate a completely different world, one that Basil Fawlty would undoubtedly find even more confusing and infuriating than the one he left behind. Others worried that the specific alchemy that made the original so brilliant was something that simply could not be reconstructed decades later under entirely different circumstances. The original was not just a well-written sitcom. It was a perfect collision of the right people, the right creative pressure, the right cultural moment, and an almost reckless willingness to go further than anyone expected. Whether that collision can happen twice is a question only time will answer. What does not remain in doubt is the legacy. 12 episodes. One infamous scene. One firestorm that never fully burned itself out. Fawlty Towers did what only the greatest art ever manages to do. It made people laugh, then made them think, then made them argue, and then refused to leave the conversation no matter how many years or decades went by. The scene that took it off the air didn't destroy the show's reputation. If anything, it burned that reputation so deeply into the history of television that nothing could ever remove it. Because you don't spend 50 years still debating something forgettable. You spend 50 years debating something that mattered then and still matters now. And that, in the end, is exactly what Basil Fawlty would have absolutely hated to hear. That all his chaos, all his humiliation, all his spectacular and very public failures were not just remembered but treasured. That the thing he least wanted anyone to see became the thing they could never look away from. That a man desperately trying to be taken seriously became, instead, one of the most beloved figures in the history of television. If you've made it this far, you clearly love a great story about television that dared to go further than it probably should have. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another deep dive into the classics that shaped our screens. And drop a comment below telling us where you stand. Was The Germans a comedy masterpiece that still deserves to be seen exactly as it was made, or did it cross a line that should have stayed uncrossed? We want to hear what you think.